One of my favorite things about being a flight instructor is identifying things that are commonly confusing or misunderstood and coming up with an easy way to help people to understand it. So this morning on Greg Brown's Student Pilot Pep Talk group, this is a private Facebook group, I noticed this post from Cal Johnson sharing his study notes, what he calls IFR Stage 1. So we're going to start off talking about something for instrument pilots, whether you're working on your instrument rating or already an instrument pilot, this can help you out. For those of you that are not working on your instrument or not instrument pilots, you're welcome to tune out for a few minutes, but I encourage you to make a note and come back and watch the recording of this when you do start studying for your instrument written, something that'll help you out. So this is I think a 30-some page document. I did glance through it. Great job, Cal. You probably want a copy of this. If you're in Greg Brown's group, you can go download it there. It's just a Word document. I will say that most of the value of this for Cal was him putting it together. Most of this is screenshots and copying and paste from other documents. What I want to focus on right now is page 3, where he's got it's a little bit blurry, but it's a screenshot of something called primary and supporting instruments. I remember way back, 1993, when I was working on my instrument rating, and this whole concept of primary and supporting instruments, I thought I understood it. I would watch the videos, I would read the FAA books, I would then go do the practice test thinking that I understood it, and I would get questions wrong. Sometimes I'd get them right, thinking I knew what was going on, and then I would get other questions wrong. I'm like, what is going on with this? After I became a flight instructor and noticed that my own instrument applicants were having trouble with this concept, I came up with what I think is a unique way to look at this. And I want to thank Kel for prompting me on this, because after many years of teaching this morning is the first time that I've ever actually written it down. Usually I'm doing this on a dry erase board and making my students write it down. So this was a fun exercise for me. So I'm going to go through this real quick. I'll try to keep this concise, and then if you guys have questions, we can talk about it. So on the left side is the document that Kel posted. On the right side is my own notes, and I encourage you to pause the video if you're watching the recording of this. Write this down yourself. Right from the top, keep in mind, control and performance is a technique for flying airplanes, and primary supporting is a philosophy. That's important because when you read the FAA, like the Instrument Flying Handbook, they really kind of confuse it. It's hard to understand. There's some other documents that try, and I think they fail. But control performance means put the airplane where you want it with the proper power setting. That's the control part. And then look at the performance and see if it's giving you the performance that you want. That's the way that we fly airplanes. Those of you in instrument training, hopefully that's the way that your instructor is teaching you. Primary and supporting, I call that a philosophy because it's really more of a concept. And as far as I know, there's still questions on the FAA written test about this whole primary supporting thing. So it's something you need to understand to get through the written test, is how I recommend you thinking of primary and supporting. Also remember, just because we call something a primary instrument, that does not mean that it's the instrument you should be looking at to make a change. Very important. A lot of people get messed up because they think, oh, the altimeter is the primary instrument in this scenario. That doesn't mean you should be looking at the altimeter when you're pitching the airplane, as one example. So just think of primary in quotes like it's just a title for something we're talking about here. For this to work, remember the rule with 2 exceptions. There's some debate about this, but it works perfectly with this whole concept. The rule is to pitch for altitude. That includes pitching for vertical speed or pitching for a glide path. And then using power to control airspeed. That's the rule. There are 2 exceptions. Exception number 1 is when power is fixed. That means maximum or minimum. So maximum power climb, obviously we have to find the magic pitch angle to hold a certain airspeed. That's exception 1. With minimum, that would be simulating an engine failure or a real engine failure. If we don't have any power, obviously we have to pitch for best glide. So those are both examples of exception 1. Exception 2 is when we're flying on the backside of the power curve. To really understand that, you got to get into some aerodynamics that I'm not going to cover right now, but hopefully when you were taught how to do slow flight, you learned that once you get in slow flight, everything's reversed with pitch and power, meaning primarily you're going to power for altitude and you're going to pitch for airspeed. Has to do with controlling the induced drag that really goes up when you're on the backside of the power curve. So those are the 2 exceptions. Otherwise, we pitch for altitude, power for airspeed. All right, so the technique for primary and supporting. Let me go ahead and explain this document on the left that Cale found. He put it in page 3 of his document. So control, there's 3 columns here. The first column is control, and that basically is referring to the control performance concept of how to fly. Primary is what we're calling, or the FAA calls a primary instrument, and then there's a supporting instrument for each of the 3 categories of pitch, bank, and power. I do wish that they included a control instrument more for power. I don't know why they left that blank. I consider the RPM or the manifold power or manifold pressure to be the control, meaning if we Cessna 172 downwind to beam the numbers, I'm going to pull the power to 1500 RPM. Actually look at the RPM and move the throttle to put the RPM right at 1500. That's a control input, and so it should say RPM for something like that. For some reason they left that blank, which is fine. Then we have the primary instrument for each of those pitch, bank, and power, and then the supporting instrument. So that's how you read the table. Hopefully you don't try to just memorize this, because if you do that, it's really confusing and it's too much to memorize. So here's a better way. Step number 1, consider the goal. That's a question. What am I trying to hold? And that means for pitch, bank, and power. And I give examples of the different goals. For pitch, when we're talking about instrument flying, it's usually going to be either holding a constant altitude or a constant vertical speed. It could be a glide path like flying an ILS approach, but I'll just keep it simple. I like to teach when you're flying like a 3-degree glide slope to pitch to find a certain vertical speed based on your ground speed, and then to watch the glide slope. Bank goals would be either constant heading or a standard rate turn. Years ago, we used to do steep turns as part of the instrument training, but we don't do that anymore. So it's pretty much just going to be a constant heading or a standard rate turn. And then power goals, usually that's for constant speed, constant airspeed. Let me change that actually, constant airspeed. Okay, so step number 2, that was step 1 of the technique, is consider the goal. What am I trying to do for pitch, bank, and power? And then here's the magic, okay? Question, step number 2, the question is ask this question for pitch, bank, and power. So you're gonna ask it 3 times. The question is, which instrument tells me if I need to make a change? That is the key. Once you understand the rule with 2 exceptions, and you understand that we've got pitch, bank, and power, simply ask which instrument tells me if I need to make a change. Not the instrument to look at to make the change, but if I need to make a change. The answer to that question is the primary instrument. And then the supporting instruments are simply all of the other instruments that would change if you make that change. Let's go through a few examples here with the diagram. Starting easy, straight and level. What is the goal for pitch? The goal is to hold constant altitude. What is the goal for bank? The goal is to hold a constant heading, because we're doing straight and level. And then power, we'll just assume we're trying to hold a certain airspeed, call it 100 knots. So heading 360, 5,000 feet, 100 knots. Those are the goals. Now that we've done step 1, we consider the goals, ask the question, which instrument tells me if I need to make a change? So which instrument tells me if I need to push the yoke forward or pull back? The only instrument with that information is the altimeter. That's why it's the primary instrument. And which instrument tells me if I need to move the ailerons left or right? The only instrument is the heading indicator, because the goal is to hold a constant heading. Which instrument tells me if I need to move the power in or out? The goal was to hold 100 knots, so the primary instrument has to be the airspeed indicator. Hopefully a light bulb just went off for a lot of you. That is the most simple way I found to teach this. Again, the supporting instruments are simply what else would change if I were to pitch, bank, or power, make adjustments. Let's just do 1 or 2 more, a little more complicated. So, showing the exception to the rule. let's see, they've got minimum controllable airspeed right here. Minimum controllable airspeed means slow flight. Well, we said that when we're in slow flight, we're primarily going to, put my cursor in the right place here, right here, pitch for airspeed. That is why the primary pitch instrument becomes the airspeed indicator. It's reversed because we're on the backside of the power curve. So this table does take that into account. And that gives me confirmation that my rule with 2 exceptions is a good way to be teaching. What's another one? Oh, it also gets confusing when they talk about, where is it? The entry, like a climb entry, they have the primary pitch instrument is the attitude indicator. That is assuming that you have figured out what the proper pitch angle is for your airplane. So not only is the attitude indicator in that moment your control instrument to control the airplane, but you're actually going to a certain pitch attitude as your primary instrument for the entry. Once you're in the entry, then you would go to, well, what is the goal? Is the goal constant airspeed or constant rate? So if the goal is a constant airspeed climb, obviously the airspeed is the only instrument that tells you if you need to make a change. If the goal is a constant rate climb, then the only instrument that tells you if you need to make a change is the vertical speed. So hopefully you can see that the answer of what the primary instrument is changes with the goal. And when you're going through the FAA written test questions and doing practice tests, and they have questions like this, that's what you need to focus on, is what is the goal? And then then ask the question, which one tells you if you need to make a change? So hopefully that helps. Again, if you're watching the recording of this, you can pause the video and write this down. There's not a lot to it. And there you go. If you have any questions, you're watching this on the recording, go ahead and post it down below in the comments, and we'll have a fun discussion about it.